Hi, it's Steve the Grumpy Hypnotist. This is part 2 of a video I did earlier called How Much Does Hypnosis Cost? And as I mentioned in a previous video, this is something that is often confusing to members of the public when they're trying to look into their various options with hypnotists, because especially in the old days, I think it was a lot easier to hide things, especially for something which is naturally mysterious like hypnosis, which isn't, a lot of these old methods of hiding and being opaque, so to speak, not transparent, I think were easier to do back in times when, you know, things like Google weren't obviously available to pretty much everyone. An example of how I've always published my fees online ever since I started, and especially back then, which was a while ago, it was a pretty controversial thing, I think. Sometimes people would encourage me not to publish my fees online for some reason. And I'll get to some of the reasons that were given, which I think are falling apart now. And again, this is mainly so that members of the public, often they're very confused by the fact that it's very hard to get information, basic information about fees, that kind of thing. And there's reasons why that approach is taken. One reason I think is because hypnosis by itself is prone to what's called information asymmetry. And that's just a fancy term for the idea that when there's a transaction and one side of the transaction has more knowledge than the other, or they should have more knowledge, it's kind of easier for one potential to be there for one side to get kind of shafted or strung along if there's a big difference in how much information each side has. A classic example of this, actually a recent example of this I came across, was in the some third world developing country where farmers had to buy fertilizer as a commodity. Apparently before, even in the third world developing countries, apparently pretty much everyone has mobile phones now, smartphones, phones of that sort. So before mobile networks, that infrastructure was penetrated into those areas, there was a big difference in how much certain farmers were paying for fertilizer. And it's what they observed in this research apparently is that as soon as the infrastructure for mobile networks and people were able to check things out on the smartphones in these countries, as soon as that happened, what they noticed is that the prices stabilized in the market because people could easily look up and do price shopping, you know. So I think obviously the same thing applies in non-developing countries and first world environments like the United States. And I think particularly it's useful and helpful and very good for the market when even for something like hypnosis, because I'll give you an example. My previous video went into more background about some of the reasons why this type of opaqueness, lack of transparency, I think is really not gonna fly anymore with the public. One thing that sometimes is used as a reason not to publish fees is this concept that it's unethical to tell people how much something might cost. It sounds kind of crazy, but this is actually a reason that I've heard used in hypnosis behind the scenes. Like, it's unethical to tell people because we don't know. Well, that's strange to me, because if you look at other professions, more professional professions usually, like licensed professions such as like licensed psychotherapists, doctors, social workers, you know, people professional counselors of that sort. Very often it's easy to find their fees. You know, they publish them online, and they provide that sort of information up front. So to me, it doesn't make any sense that hypnotists should be some special category where, well, like a psychiatrist who can prescribe medication, you know, is actually an MD, that type of thing. It's ethical for them to publish their fees, but it would be unethical for hypnotists to do so. You know, what's that about? That's just an excuse, really. It's especially silly in my mind when there's a pretty common thing that's used on hypnosis websites, I observe, where there's this study which is touted. It's not even a real study. It was like an article written a long time ago, but you might have run across this if you've done any research. where hypnotists will say things like, hypnosis was proven successful in 95% of cases over 6 sessions, and that's compared to whatever 10% success rate of 300 sessions of psychotherapy or psychoanalysis, something crazy like that. Now, you might have seen that statistic. I've seen it all over the place because people just copy and paste that stuff and they put it on their sites. It's complete nonsense. And the origin, I don't have to get into this now, but the origin of that, even the place where it originates from, I don't think they support that at all. But it's just complete garbage. Because if you think about it, do you think someone who's going to see a hypnotist, they might have a different issue compared to someone who's doing psychoanalysis or psychotherapy for years, decades even? That's like 2 different things. Hypnosis can be used perhaps in certain contexts, and even in that longer term work. But anyway, it's not the same thing. But the point is especially silly, combined with this idea of not telling people how much something might cost or how many sessions it might take. And then if someone has that made up study on their site, they cite that saying 95% success with 6 sessions of hypnosis compared to 10% with 300 sessions of psychotherapy or counseling over years and years. Now, there's a contradiction there, which should be obvious to anyone with a brain, that if the hypnotist says they can't publish their fees because they don't know how much time it'll take, how many sessions it'll take, or how much it'll cost, at the same time they have on their site something like 95% success with 6 sessions, what's that about? I mean, isn't that kind of implying how many sessions it might take? Really? Unless someone has to get a 5%, but again, those numbers are just completely made up. So again, it's just a real clear example of, I think, this kind of thing that when people in the public are coming across this stuff, you're right to be confused and to wonder, this doesn't make any sense, because it doesn't really. And again, I just mentioned this because it partly is a message to the hypnotist that try to get the message, kind of the message discipline in line so that the message actually makes sense. But again, people make different choices in terms of publishing their fees. Like I said, I've always published my fees online at CenterCityHypnosis.com ever since I started. No big deal. Tell people how much something costs, and then they can make their own choices. But again, I really encourage people to trust their instinct and to trust their own sense of what seems kind of real and what isn't. Again, because this whole idea of 95% success in 6 sessions with hypnosis, it just drives me nuts, because that's, even without the combination of that ridiculous thing, well, we can't tell you how many sessions something will cost. Even without that by itself, and if you see that statistic or you run across it and you think, this doesn't seem right, you're right, because if you dig into it further, it's just based on nothing. Once again, it's Steve the Grumpy Hypnotist. I'm sorry I get a little bit riled up about this, but because I've been doing this for a while, I have seen positive progression in terms of transparency, people being more open. But I still hope that people, hypnotists especially, are working at becoming more in line with the environment now. Like I said, with information asymmetry, people are able to do their research very easily, like farmers in wherever, third world country or something. Obviously people in your community, in your city, in your town can do that as well. So the old tricks and the old methods are not going to fly anymore. And hopefully that helps people think about, well, maybe ways to actually to do things in a way that would help themselves as hypnotists, but also members of the public, which is what we should be doing, right? So, okay, once again, it's Steve the Grumpy Hypnotist. Thanks, bye.